One of the things that stood out about serving time at High Desert State Prison was its geographic isolation. You see, it was built outside of the rural town of Susanville in Lassen County in northern California. I believe the nearest urban center is Reno, Nevada, about an hour and a half away. And of course, because Reno is in a different state, very few high desert inmates knew anybody in Reno. This creates a circumstance where the prison has its own culture, its own feel, because nobody knows anybody within hundreds of miles of the prison. One thing this results in is a difficulty in smuggling contraband into the institution. You see, generally, the way inmates will get drugs or anything like that into the prison is either by convincing a friend or family member to come and visit them and hand them stuff covertly in the visiting room, or by flipping an officer and convincing him to smuggle drugs or whatever into the institution in exchange for substantial monetary gain. These things are both a lot more difficult to accomplish if you don't know anybody in the area. So there was very few drugs on the yard at High Desert compared to most prisons. I don't mean to say there was none. If you had the money and you knew the right people, I'm sure you could always get your hands on something. But most prison yards, if you just sat and waited, somebody was going to come up and offer to sell you drugs because they were so abundant. At High Desert, this was not the case. You had to really seek them out. Unless, and this occasionally happened, somebody established a pipeline. Perhaps they found a friend or family member who was willing to risk the drive and the smuggling charge. Or maybe they found a correctional officer who felt that he wanted the money more than he wanted to be free from the threat of criminal prosecution. One occasion in which the yard was just flooded with drugs because somebody had established a pipeline was near the end of 2004. This was the time period whenever Scooby had woken up in the middle of the night, snuggling his hot pot, just high out of his mind. A lot of other interesting things happened in the same time period because of the abundance of drugs on the yard. I recall one occasion, probably 4 or 5 days after the Scooby incident, whenever I had been walking to breakfast with a number of other Caucasian inmates. You see, inmates of an ethnic group generally clump together in groups of 8, 10, maybe 12 guys to go to and from meals. This is so that if a riot kicks off, you'll already be grouped with people who you can trust, who are going to have your back. On the walk, several of us noticed that Spaz, a guy who lived 5 cells down from me in 134 with his cellie Dave, had a goose egg on his head. It looked like he'd been punched in the forehead real hard or something like that. And we kind of approached him and went, "Hey Spaz, you all right? Hey Dave, come here, let's talk about this." Trying to figure out if they'd gotten into a fight, because if they had, it would be a violation of policy. You are not allowed to get into a fight with your cellie on these yards. There's a hands-off policy. We all knew Spaz had been fine whenever he'd went into the cell at 9 o'clock last night, so obviously something had happened. Dave was embarrassed. He was half laughing, half trying to not tell the story, but knowing he had to because this was serious business. And Spaz was just kind of chuckling into his hand and also embarrassed, but letting Dave tell the story. Essentially what had happened was that at about midnight, Dave had woken up to the strong smell of feces. This happens occasionally. You have a toilet in the cell, and it's like a foot away from the foot of your bed. It's a very small, almost airtight room, and things can smell pretty bad when somebody has to use the restroom. Dave had woken up, facing the wall, and rolled away from the wall to yell at Spaz, "Hey Spaz, go flush the toilet a couple of times, or, spray something that smells good, do something, it stinks in here." And as he had rolled away, he had come just face to butt cheek with Spaz, who had been squatting on the desk right next to Dave's bed, pants around his ankles. What's the euphemism here? He was utilizing the facilities. He was in the middle of sending a letter to the warden. Whatever phrase you want to use, it was just about the most repugnant thing somebody could wake up to and roll over to being right here. David leapt out of bed and grabbed Spaz by the lapel and pulled him to get him off the desk. Because Spaz was half unconscious, high on heroin, had his pants around his ankles, and had been distracted because of what he was doing, he'd lost his balance badly and just smacked his head against the locker and opened it up pretty good. We were relieved and trying to not laugh too much about what must have been a pretty embarrassing story for the two of them to have to tell. But Spaz had been high on heroin, and that's technically within the rules. You're allowed to get high if you want to, especially if it's the middle of the night and the doors are closed and there's no way you could get caught. So no rules had been violated. They hadn't been fighting. It had just been an embarrassing occurrence that happens whenever two guys live in a small room and one of them is high out of his gourd. There are a number of little incidental things that happen whenever a yard is just flooded with drugs like this. For instance, the walk to breakfast. There are communal restrooms out on the yard, just open air, 3 or 4 toilets on every yard in case somebody has an emergency and has to use them because inmates are out in the yard for hours at a time. On the walk to breakfast this day, I don't doubt that I saw 3, 4, maybe even 5 people go running to those toilets and throw up. This is because whenever a yard is flooded like this, some guys are just so high they shouldn't be walking to breakfast in the first place, and other guys are coming down and nauseous because they're coming down off of drugs. Another little, I suppose, perk for somebody who isn't a drug user, like myself, whenever the drugs hit the yard this strong, is that at breakfast, you clean up. This was a Sunday, the day in question, and they serve fried eggs and sausage links. It's the best breakfast they give. Everybody's always excited about it. They call it the Grand Slam. And I probably got 3 or 4 full trays worth of food on this day because everybody around me was just so nauseous from drug use that there was an abundance of food. Of course, the yard being flooded with drugs can't last for forever. Something will happen to end the party for the addicts. Maybe somebody will get stabbed over a drug debt they can't pay. Or perhaps the administration will catch the guy bringing stuff in red-handed. Or, as was the case in this instance, maybe somebody will OD. An acquaintance of mine, Mike, Hell's Angel, was found dead in his cell of heroin overdose about 3 days later in the morning. There was some dispute amongst the inmates at the time as to whether he had intended to kill himself or accidentally overdosed. You see, this was the period of time in which they were gathering DNA from all of the inmates who had not already submitted it. If you're arrested today in California, they take your DNA automatically. However, before they had that policy, many people had started lengthy prison sentences and had not ever submitted a DNA sample. Mike was one of these people. Whenever they got his DNA from him, it hit on a cold case, and he'd been informed that rather than paroling in a couple of months, as he thought was going to happen, he was going to be remanded to his county jail and be tried for a murder in connection to the DNA he had submitted. He'd been despondent, distant after this had happened for 2, maybe 3 weeks before the heroin hit. And understandably so, he'd thought that he was going to parole, and instead he was likely to spend the rest of his life in prison. Whenever he died, the administration took it incredibly seriously. As you can imagine, it looks bad to the warden, to the staff, to everybody if somebody dies of a drug overdose in a secure facility where there's supposed to be no drugs whatsoever. They locked the building down. Nobody was allowed to come or go without an escort. They did interviews. They searched. I don't know if they actually caught the guy that had been bringing the drugs into the institution, But I know that whenever we finally came off lockdown, the yard was dry again, and Scooby was back to scrounging up what little drugs he could find instead of having just a huge amount of them. Drugs are a funny thing. They can take a situation where you just feel miserable, where everything is terrible, and they can make you feel like things are going to be okay, like it's going to be good. And believe me, I understand the temptation of feeling like things are going to be good whenever you know they're not. But it's a lie. You consider Mike. He'd found out that he was going to die in prison, and he felt like his life was over. Things couldn't get any worse. So he turned to heroin. And he died in prison. And his life was over, and things couldn't get any worse. They took the imagined worst case scenario and turned it into a reality. And that's what drugs do. They may make you feel like things are better, but they always make things worse. That's the price. It's the trade-off. I realize that the don't do drugs, the just say no shtick is a little trite. So instead, my advice to you is don't lie to yourself about what they do. Don't believe that drugs make things better, because they don't. They're a lie.